Jimmy met Dylan once. Both stoned, just laughed, never spoke again. Dylan, I wish he was here. The Kettle of Fish, a bar on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village, New York. The kind of place where folk musicians, poets, beatniks, and people trying to be any or all of those things gathered in dim light and cigarette smoke to drink cheap beer and talk about changing the world through art. The walls were decorated with random memorabilia, old photos, concert posters, things left behind by regulars who'd moved on or moved up. The jukebox played Dylan, the Stones, whatever someone had fed quarters into. The booths were worn, the bar was sticky, the bathroom was questionable, but it was real, authentic in a way that mattered to people who valued authenticity above all else. This was Dylan's village, the neighborhood that had made him, the clubs where he played for donations, the streets where he'd walked broke and unknown, the scene that had elevated him from Minnesota dreamer to voice of a generation. He still came back sometimes when he could, when he needed to remember what it felt like before everything got so complicated. On this particular night, the exact date lost to history and intoxication, two men found themselves in the same space. One was already famous, the other was nobody. Bob Dylan, 25 years old, was at the peak of his powers and the center of a cultural storm. He'd gone electric the previous year, scandalizing the folk purists who'd made him famous. His album Blonde on Blonde had just been released and was being hailed as a masterpiece. He was touring constantly, recording constantly, living constantly in the public eye. He was exhausted and probably looking for a quiet drink where he could just be another person in a bar. Jimi Hendrix, 23 years old, was a session guitarist living in New York, playing backup for whoever would hire him. He'd spent years touring the Chitlin circuit in the South, playing behind Little Richard and the Isley Brothers, never getting his name on a marquee, never getting recognition. He was talented. Everyone who heard him play knew that. But talent without opportunity is just frustration. He was struggling to pay rent, struggling to eat, struggling to be seen as anything more than hired hands on a Stratocaster.
But Jimmy knew who Bob Dylan was. Of course he did. Everyone knew Dylan. Dylan was what Jimmy aspired to be, an artist who'd broken through, who was taken seriously, who got to make the music he wanted to make. The exact circumstances of how they met that night aren't documented in any reliable source. Did someone introduce them? Some mutual friend or acquaintance who knew both? Did Jimmy work up the courage to approach Dylan directly, his hero sitting right there in the same bar, an opportunity that might never come again? Did Dylan, in a rare moment of approachability, lowered inhibitions from alcohol, strike up a conversation with this unknown guitarist who happened to be standing next to him? We don't know. What we know comes from what both men said about it years later, when one was trying to remember through the fog of intoxication and time, and the other was trying to forget his embarrassment at having wasted such a moment. Jimmy's version, told in 1967 to journalist Steve Barker in one of his earliest British interviews, "I saw him one time, but both of us were stoned out of our minds. I remember it vaguely. It was at this place called the Kettle of Fish in the Village. We were both stoned there and we just hung around laughing. Yeah, we just laughed." Just laughed. Two words that contain everything about the moment and nothing about what it could have been. Dylan's version, told much later with his characteristic vagueness about anything personal, was similar but briefer and more dismissive. Both were pretty drunk, he said, maybe even stoned out of their minds. He remembered Jimmy as just the guitar player in some band whose name he couldn't recall, not yet anyone he needed to remember, not yet anyone who would matter to his life or his music. So there they were, two future legends. One already legendary, one still invisible, both intoxicated to the point where forming coherent thoughts was difficult and forming coherent memories was impossible. And what did they do with this moment? They laughed.
Not talked about music. not discussed songwriting or guitar technique or the state of rock and roll, not shared their dreams or their struggles or their thoughts on what it meant to be an artist. They just hung around laughing. At what? Neither could remember later. Probably at nothing. Probably at everything. The way people laugh when they're drunk and the world seems both absurd and beautiful. It couldn't have lasted long. An hour at most, probably less. Then they went their separate ways. Dylan back to being Bob Dylan, with all the weight that carried. Jimi back to being nobody, with all the invisibility that meant. And that was it. The only time Jimi Hendrix and Bob Dylan were in the same room, talking to each other, existing in the same moment. One meeting, one night, one opportunity for connection that became nothing but vague laughter and hazier memories. Within months, everything would change for Jimi, though he couldn't have known it that night at the Kettle of Fish when he was just another struggling musician hoping for a break. Chaz Chandler, former bassist for the Animals, who was now looking to manage artists, saw him playing at the Café Wah in the Village and immediately knew he was witnessing something special, something that needed to be heard by the world. In September 1966, just months after that drunken night with Dylan, Chandler convinced Jimi to come to London, promising him opportunities that didn't exist in America for a black guitarist who wanted to lead his own band and play his own music. By December 1966, barely 3 months after leaving New York, Jimi had recorded Hey Joe and was becoming a sensation in Britain. By March 1967, he was famous throughout Europe. By June, after Monterey, he was legendary worldwide, the guitar player everyone was talking about, the one who'd set his instrument on fire and become a god. And Dylan? He had his motorcycle accident in July 1966, just a month or two after that meeting with Jimi. The accident, the details of which remain mysterious, possibly less severe than reported, but used as an excuse to escape, became his reason to retreat to Woodstock, to get away from the punishing tour schedule, the constant pressure, the weight of being the voice of a generation. When he emerged with new music, he was different, quieter, more introspective, more interested in being a husband and father than in being Bob Dylan the icon.
Both men transformed in 1966 and 1967. Both became different versions of themselves. Both, in different ways, struggled with who they were versus who people wanted them to be. But they never spoke again, never had a second chance at that meeting, never got to have the conversation sober, clear-headed, both understanding who the other was and what they might mean to each other. In 1968, Jimi recorded All Along the Watchtower. He transformed Dylan's sparse acoustic meditation into an electric prophecy. When Dylan heard it, he was overwhelmed. He changed the way he played his own song to match what Jimi had done. He wanted to tell Jimi what it meant to him. He wanted to ask Jimi how he'd heard those things in the song. He wanted to have a real conversation. But by then, Jimi was in London, then on tour, then recording. Dylan was in Woodstock, raising his family, avoiding the music industry. Their lives had diverged. The moment for reconnection never came. In 1968 and 1969, Jimi lived in Woodstock, 400 meters from Dylan's house, close enough to walk, close enough to knock on the door, but he never did. Maybe he remembered that night at the Kettle of Fish, the laughing, the lack of real connection, and didn't want to repeat it. Maybe he was too intimidated. Maybe he was waiting for an invitation that never came. Dylan, for his part, never reached out. Maybe he didn't know Jimi was there. Maybe he knew but was protecting his privacy. Maybe he was waiting too, for the right moment, the right excuse. Whatever the reasons, 2 years passed. 2 years of being neighbors, 2 years of missed opportunities, 2 years of silence between two men who had so much to say to each other, but never said it.
In September 1970, Jimi Hendrix died, 27 years old.
Gone before he could have had the conversation he'd probably been hoping for since that night at the Kettle of Fish 4 years earlier. And Bob Dylan was left with a specific kind of regret. Not the regret of having done something wrong, but the regret of having done nothing when something could have been done. The regret of one meeting that was wasted on laughter and intoxication. The regret of being neighbors who never spoke. The regret of gratitude that was never properly expressed. In interviews over the years, Dylan talked about Jimi with a particular kind of sadness. He praised Jimi's versions of his songs effusively. He said Jimi had taken his small songs that nobody paid any attention to and brought them to the outer limits of the stratosphere. He said Jimi had found things in those songs that he himself hadn't known were there. But the most telling thing Dylan ever said about Jimi came in 2015 at his MusiCares Person of the Year acceptance speech. After talking about what Jimi had done with his music, Dylan said simply, "I have to thank Jimi. I wish he was here." I wish he was here, present tense, as if the absence is still immediate, still painful, as if 45 years isn't long enough to get used to the loss. Think about what Dylan is saying in those words. Not, "I wished I'd thanked him when he was alive." Not, "I wish we'd stayed in touch." Not even, "I miss him." Just, "I wish he was here." As if the only thing preventing the conversation is Jimi's absence, not Dylan's failure to have it when Jimi was alive and living 400 meters away. The story of Jimi and Dylan's relationship isn't really a story at all. It's an absence shaped like a story. It's a series of almosts and could-have-beens and why-didn'ts. They met once, both too stoned to form memories or connections, both too caught up in their own situations, Dylan in his fame, Jimi in his obscurity, to recognize the moment for what it could have been.
They could have met again in 1968 or 1969 when Jimi lived nearby, but they didn't. Jimi could have knocked on Dylan's door. Dylan could have knocked on Jimi's, but neither did. They could have had a conversation about music, about All Along the Watchtower, about what it meant to be an artist trying to maintain integrity in a world that wants to consume you, but they didn't. And then Jimi died, and all the could-have-beens became never-will-be's. What makes this story particularly tragic is that we know, from both men's later comments, from interviews and speeches and offhand remarks, that they wanted to connect, that the connection mattered to both of them, or at least would have mattered if they'd known what they had to offer each other. Jimi talked about Dylan constantly in interviews throughout his brief career. He said Dylan's songs felt so close to him that he felt like he'd written them himself. He said Dylan had shown him how to be an artist within the circus of popular music, how to maintain integrity while existing in a system designed to exploit you. He styled his wild afro to look like Dylan's equally wild hair from 1966. He covered Dylan's songs, not just All Along the Watchtower, but also Like a Rolling Stone, Drifter's Escape, others. He moved to Woodstock specifically to try to understand what Dylan had found there, what transformation had occurred in those mountains that had allowed Dylan to survive fame without being destroyed by it. Every action Jimi took suggested he was still thinking about Dylan, still trying to understand him, still hoping somehow to connect with him in a meaningful way. That night at the Kettle of Fish was supposed to be that connection, but intoxication and circumstance had turned it into nothing but laughter and vague memories. Dylan, after hearing Jimi's version of Watchtower, wanted to talk to Jimi about it. He wanted to ask questions, express gratitude, understand. He changed his own performances to honor what Jimi had done. He's been playing the song Jimi's Way for 50 years. They both wanted the connection, but somehow, between 1966 and 1970, they never managed to make it happen. One meeting, one wasted opportunity, then nothing but silence and eventual loss. The last thing Jimi said about meeting Dylan in a 1969 interview was this: I only met him once about 3 years ago, back at the Kettle of Fish on McDougal Street. That was before I went to England. I think both of us were pretty drunk at the time, so he probably doesn't remember it. He probably doesn't remember it. Even in 1969, a year before his death, Jimi assumed he wasn't memorable to Dylan, assumed their meeting was as meaningless to Dylan as it was foggy to him. But Dylan did remember it, at least vaguely. He remembered Jimi as just the guitar player. He remembered being drunk. He remembered it being brief. What Dylan didn't know until it was too late was that the guitar player he'd laughed with for an hour in 1966 would become one of the most important musicians of the century, would transform his songs into classics, would live 400 meters away seeking the same transformation Dylan had found, would die at 27 before they could have a real conversation. Now, more than 50 years after Jimi's death, Bob Dylan still says, "I wish he was here." Still plays All Along the Watchtower the way Jimi taught him to play it. Still carries the weight of a conversation that never happened, a gratitude that was never properly expressed, a connection that was never made despite multiple opportunities. One meeting, the Kettle of Fish, 1966, both stoned, just laughing, then never again. Then 50 years of wishing it had been different. If this story of wasted opportunities and eternal regret moved you, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that the moments we waste often haunt us longer than the mistakes we make. Have you ever had one chance at something important and wasted it? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video for more stories of the meetings that should have mattered more.